Welcome, everyone. My name is Nat Trask, and I'm here to talk about structure-preserving scientific machine learning and how that can help microelectronics co-design. So when we talk about traditional design, we have this hierarchy on the left in mind, where you're designing a system, but you as a subject matter expert live on one rung of the ladder. You design your component perhaps optimally, and then you take your design and you toss it over the fence to the person that's at the next rung up. And in that way, information kind of propagates in this one-way manner, maybe with a few iterations until you've designed the whole system. So microelectronics, we're considering systems which can consist of devices, components, and materials spanning quantum to continuum, maybe to digital discrete scales. Right, and we want to get this system squeezed down onto a tiny footprint. And so when you go to small length scales, the physics coupling each one of these, the linkages of this graph, they become tightly coupled. And so you can't just do things in isolation. You have to take a holistic viewpoint and design everything all at once, right? And so this is what we mean when we say co-design, as we'd like this sort of unified means of simulating the coupled behavior. And so we have this well-established software simulation stack, right? To simulate a material, we do molecular dynamics or DFT. To simulate a component, we think of TCAD models, drift diffusion equations, or Maxwell's equations. At the device level, we think of compact models, right? Kirchhoff's laws, which are encoded in ODEs, systems of ODEs to solve, and so on up until you get your system scale model. And so each one of these things is very expensive, right? So a single one of these rungs of the ladder would be a massive supercomputer simulation. But we can imagine that if somehow we could make it so that they were each free, we could attempt to do a monolithic computation, right? Where you couple them all together. And now you can see when you turn a knob on parameters of the material part, how's that reflected up through the entire hierarchy? And so what we're going to explore is how machine learning can be used to achieve surrogates that can achieve that goal. So where does one-way design break down? The material level, you're talking about launching huge supercomputing campaigns to do MD or DFT for a given material. The component level, say you want TCAD for a transistor, you're talking about maybe up to 1 million elements to simulate that single component. And the system might have millions of transistors in it, right? So that doesn't scale up. So in order to scale it up, you go to compact models for the device level. These like Kirchhoff's laws style circuit models often take decades to develop, right? So people are kind of empirically, or up to a decade to develop. The people are empirically trying to like add a diode here, a capacitor there, trying to get the right asymptotic behavior, all these kind of things, which just takes time in order to develop, right? And so while this stack might work well for traditional devices, CMOS and things like that, so you go to novel materials, right? Like maybe your compact model no longer holds and you have to go back to the drawing board and start over. And now you've lost your entire simulation capability. So at Sandia, we're looking at things like GaN diodes, 3-5 materials, silicon photonics, things like that, where there isn't this kind of established hierarchy or pipeline. And so also in terms of fabrication, we might design a system, but only be able to spin up one fabrication per year, right? And so there isn't a lot of trial and error here. We don't get feedback in terms of, oh, you were missing this interaction, the bridges scales in this way, right? We just get one fabrication and maybe it fails, right? So we need better tools. And so we'd like to, like I said, we want to bridge this hierarchy. We have this graph. And so the linkages of this graph correspond to different things, different kinds of inter-device interactions, different multiphysics, different devices, components, materials. And so we'd like to use machine learning to surrogate out each one of these linkages. And in order to do that, these linkages need certain mathematical robustness guarantees. We need accuracy, meaning that machine learned model can be as arbitrarily accurate as our given application needs, which isn't often the case for deep learning. You need stable coupling. So if you learn one of these linkages in isolation, it's guaranteed to be stable and predictive and to generalize well once you hook it in and couple it together with all these other linkages. And it needs to be structure preserving. So probably most importantly, these models have certain physical invariances associated with them, things like conservation structure and so on. And if this is meant to be a digital twin to help us achieve a design, right, it needs to predict a design that's physically realizable in practice, right? We can actually fabricate it. So there's a distinction I'd like to draw between traditional black box machine learning and scientific machine learning. And there's all sorts of hype and excitement, a lot of it well-deserved, some of it not well-deserved, about people taking like their direct numerical simulation, throwing it into TensorFlow, all of a sudden it's 1,000 times faster. But there's a difference between this black box picture, right, where really what you're doing is you have a set of inputs and outputs, you're training a network in order to reproduce this database. And in the process, building kind of a glorified solution lookup table, right? There's no causal information there. There's no physics modeling or subject matter expertise, which would let it be able to extrapolate, right? Or perform out of distribution inference. Whereas what we're attempting with scientific machine learning modeling is we're actually learning a physical dynamical system that matches the data. And so what that means, like if you want to extrapolate, right, you want to look outside of the training set that you use to generate the model, that's okay, because in a sense, you're applying different initial or boundary conditions, right? The governing equations themselves are unchanged. And so what that means is that if you're exploring this design space, there's all these things that could go wrong, right? And this provides guardrails, right? This can only suggest designs which are physically realizable, and it keeps you from wasting time where, this kind of interpolant has suggested something that can't actually be realized in practice. So in my group, we primarily focus on mathematical foundations of scientific machine learning. And the work I'm going to present today comes from my DOE early career project and also a Mimic Center that I'm a part of with George Karniadakis at Brown. But for the last year or so, we've been embedded in different microelectronics co-design problems around the lab, where the electrical engineers and the physicists are telling us, this is what we need to design. These are the physics that are at play, and this is how we need the machine learning to work. And then we went off and we developed tools that attempted to meet those needs. And so in the process of doing this, we've considered a wide range of physics and different applications. I'm not going to talk about all these today, but things like data-driven semiconductor models, shock magnetohydrodynamics for the pulse-powered fusion devices at Sandia, subsurface models, solid mechanics, and so on. So for all of these, there's this common thread, which is that if you'd like to perform high consequence engineering, right, like the kinds of things we do at Sandia, you need to develop trust in the sense that these data-driven models need to be predictive. Like you need to know that they're not going to go wrong just because you've trained them in not quite the right way, or if, all those sorts of details, right? And so the idea is we'd like to take the mathematical structure that you use to traditionally design forward modeling and simulation capabilities and work that into machine learning. I'm going to break this talk up into 3 parts. First, an exemplar co-design problem to show what we mean by a digital twin and hopefully establish some requirements for how we need the machine learning to work in order for it to map on to reality. Then we'll get into that specific mathematical machinery and what we've been developing there. And finally, in part 3, we'll take maybe a forward-looking perspective and ask questions about, once you have this digital twin for the device that you're interested in, that you're trying to design, what can you do now that previously might not have been feasible? So this is the device we're going to consider. It's an optical communications device. It's a laser that sits on a satellite. While the overall system itself is large at about 1 meter cubed, the laser is quite small. And what's taking up all this space is a mechanical system whose job is to point and steer the laser, right? And so this is meant to go up into space. We'd like it to be lighter and have a smaller footprint for that reason. And so the idea here is we'd like to design a microelectronics device which completely removes the mechanical system and does this all with silicon photonics. So the challenge there is, yes, we've made it small, but we pay the price that we have all these different components to this design that are all so close to each other that their physics are tightly coupled. Now to get into a sense of like, what is this thing? How does it work? It starts at this laser diode, you apply a voltage drop, and then recombination within the diode generates photons, and then photons combine into optical wavelength electromagnetic waves, right? So then those waves are pushed into a data modulator, which shapes the light in order to encode data, right? This is the signal that we're going to be broadcasting using the laser. And now we send that signal through splitters in order to obtain multiple copies of the same signal. So as you split it, you reduce the power by half each time. And now you need to feed it into optical op amps in order to boost the power back up. And now at this point, toward the left here, we're left with multiple identical copies of the same signal. And so what we'd like to do is engineer, modulate the phase of each one of those signals so that we can achieve constructive or destructive interference. And that way we can use that as a mechanism in order to point and steer the laser coming out. And in order to achieve that, what we do is we apply a voltage drop across these phase shifters. That voltage drop induces a temperature differential. And that temperature differential modulates the magnetic permittivity, right? And that within the silicon photonic waveguide. And that's the way that we're able to manipulate this thing as required. But of course, now this is a lot of moving parts with a lot of different physics, and they're all tightly coupled. So let's go block by block to get a sense of how they're working. This is the laser diode. And so if you were to do forward simulation for this, you would solve the semiconductor equations like drift diffusion equations, which have a recombination term here, which prescribes how photons are generated. And those act as a source within Maxwell's equations, right? And this is how these photons are converted within the laser into electromagnetic waves that are pushed through the waveguide. Okay, and so the requirement we have here for structure preservation is as you go through these different representations of light, right? You need to hand off from one kind of physics to the other kind of physics to the next one in a way that you're not violating conservation of energy. So that's one notion of structure preservation. Another building block that we're going to have to build is this phase shifter. So in this phase shifter, right, this, like I said, we're inducing a thermal gradient. So that means we need to simulate the thermal physics within this component. And then those thermal physics modulate the permittivity, right? So that's the material property within Maxwell's equation. And so here we need this tight coupling between electromagnetism and the thermal physics in order to get this control logic, right? This is the mechanism that we're using in order to shape and steer the beam itself, right? So we need a good coupled multi-physics representation. Now let's zoom out and look at the device overall. So there's a geometric question about where you're going to stick each one of these components on the device. And as you squeeze everything down to a smaller and smaller footprint, on the bottom left here, we see that as the device gets smaller, the temperature rises. Okay, and now in this middle picture, this is showing exactly what happens thermally and how that impacts the system. You have the terminal, which is applying voltage to drive things at this indium contact. And so that has a thermal bloom, right, associated with it. And now that thermal bloom is affecting the permittivity, and that changes the optical response within the waveguide, right? So this thermal physics is actually degrading the performance of the device. And the way we address that, we mitigate that in the design, is by manipulating or engineering the material part of the system. So we can introduce some epoxy underfill with desirable heat transfer properties. And in that way, we can steer it back into the realm where things are working properly. So as you can see, right, this spans all of this hierarchy that we've been talking about. And you need to get each one of these components simultaneously in order to solve this design problem. Finally, I'd like to call attention to the fact that, so shown here at the top of this figure is a side view. The top half of this side view, you see all of the silicon photonics, but underneath it, you have the digital logic and the power supply, right? Like the piping and the infrastructure that's running this actual system. And so if you want to embed some sort of digital twin in here to do some sort of optimal control or whatever it is you want to use machine learning for, you can't stick a GPU cluster in there to do inference on your neural network, right? It's big, and the whole point is to make it small. So this calls into question exciting opportunities for different kinds of edge computing, right? Where you can take novel, low power learning architectures, things like neuromorphic computing, and embed them alongside this so that you can do inference of this digital twin for whatever your task might be. Okay, so now hopefully that gives a sense of what it is we're trying to achieve and why it's so important to get these individual guarantees from block to block. Now we're going to get into the math and these three ingredients that I'm going to introduce to get this right. And we have this sort of archetype to keep in mind. So what we're trying to do is to build a database of high fidelity simulations, perhaps parameterized by some design variable that lives at the quantum scale or the atomistic scale. We're going to use machine learning to partition these into to partition space into physics informed subdomains. And now we can use a graph in order to encode those subdomains. So nodes correspond to the volumes, edges correspond to the interface between two volumes. What we'd like to learn is a model which encodes the fluxes or the circulations, right? How these subdomains interact with each other. And what we're after here is something that doesn't just fit the data well, but gives certain guarantees so that now when you take this graph model and you embed it in a circuit simulator like SPICE, right, it's guaranteed to be stable and reliable, and it's not going to make the rest of your simulation pipeline explode. The first ingredient we'll discuss is accuracy. And so in traditional modeling and simulation, grid refinement is a bedrock of verification and validation. You need to show that if you refine your solution twice, right, the answer doesn't change. And so for neural networks, you don't have that. So as you go to a deeper network or a wider network, your solution eventually will stagnate and you're stuck in a local minimizer. And so you have some fraction of a % of accuracy typically for a range of different learning architectures. And so we've been doing a lot of research to develop new architectures which have these kind of convergence guarantees and accuracy guarantees. And the idea here is we're going the same way that a finite element mesh would partition space and let you do piecewise polynomial approximation. We use classification networks in order to build a hierarchy of partitions of space, but this is totally mesh free, right? There's no human in the loop or mesh generation. And then on each one of those things, we can fit a polynomial model. We have fast optimizers in order to do it. And you can train this hierarchy with a V-cycle thing that goes up and down. And so if you want to approximate this piecewise smooth function, the dashed blue line here, what's happening is it's finding these partitions of space and it drives the error down to machine precision. So say you wanted to do something like build a data-driven model for a GaN diode. This is in forward bias mode, and you have data either from simulation or experiment for IV curves across this device. So this is challenging because at low voltages, you have this ideal diode like exponential scaling, whereas at large voltages, you have this resistor like linear scaling. And so this is a very challenging non-parametric regression problem spanning 5 orders of magnitude. And so this hierarchical viewpoint is able, without a human in the loop, right? You just feed it a stack of IV curves, it spits out a bunch of machine learned models that you can go off and embed. Next, we'll turn to physics preservation. And so in forward simulation of electromagnetism, edge and phase finite elements, or Ravier-Thomas or Nedelec finite elements are like the cornerstone of how to get predictive simulations. And so what we're after here is to design a graph neural network architecture, which encodes the exact same kind of information, right? So we're going to engineer that architecture the same way you would traditionally design a finite element space. And so what these finite element space, this will give the same sorts of guarantees that you get out of finite elements, things like relevant conservation structures preserved. You get a formal stability analysis that lets you make guarantees about how this is going to extrapolate, and then you'll get a numerically stable model. And most importantly for E&M is that you get this mimetic treatment of the involution condition, right? You need the magnetic field to be exactly divergence free in order to be predictive. And so what we extract here is basically machine learnable div, grad, and curl, like from the familiar vector calculus, analogs to that, with the property that the divergence of the curl is equal to the curl of the gradient, and that's equal to 0. And I'm not going to get into the math here. I'll refer to to this other lecture at the bottom of the page if you're interested there. What this gives you when you have that exact sequence structure, as it's called, is you get a machine learnable DRAM complex, which preserves all of this algebraic structure, and it gives you certain building blocks that you can use. And so how do we build a model out of this, right? This lets us pose, you can make an ansatz that there is a conservation principle underlying the fields that you'd like to machine learn. And then you're going to machine learn fluxes here. And so we're going to machine learn these generalized fluxes in terms of a diffusive flux. This is like working with artificial viscosity. This gives you like a nice elliptic, stable building block that facilitates analysis. And then you have this black box neural network thing that we assume no a priori structure for. And so we learn our physics as a nonlinear perturbation of a diffusion problem, and that lets us prove lots of things about it, including that a solution exists, it's unique and it's stable, and that lets us do things like work with equality constraint optimization. And so that's how we can exactly enforce physics in these kind of architectures, in contrast to things like physics-informed machine learning, which is popular and also useful in its own way, but only enforces physics by penalty. So here's an example where we've used this to build a surrogate for lithium-ion batteries. So on the left here, this is a CT scan. We have a voxelized representation of a microstructure. Blue is lithium particles, orange is a conductive binder, white is a structural matrix. And so we have tools at Sandia to automatically build meshes from these voxelized microstructures. And it's a super expensive thing. Even for this simple 2D problem, we're looking at about 6 million elements. But that tells you exactly how the electric field, how the lithium concentration, how that all percolates through this microstructure and gives you these pathways. And so what our framework gives us is a way of extracting a finite element space that preserves these transport pathways, gets all of this conservation correct, and we can reproduce this high fidelity simulation using only 8 elements while maintaining under 1% error. So that means we've extracted a model where now you're just solving an 8x8 matrix instead of a 6 million matrix. And so that's essentially free, right? So now we can use this finite element and couple it to other things to, if you want to design like a battery pack, for example, and this is how we can scale up the microstructure. Finally, we'd like to couple across scales. And so there's a lot of work going on at Sandia, led by people like Aidan Thompson, Mitch Woods, Svetoslav Nikolov, where you'd like to use, like some physics, you need a density functional theory type description of the physics. Thermomagnetism is one of those kinds of things. And so what they've been working on and making a lot of progress on is how to machine learn a molecular dynamics potential designed to reproduce those physics that live on the quantum scale. And so here they're learning spin dynamics, right? So now you have a model for the magnetic spin that lives on each atom, which would traditionally be something at the DFT level. And so what we can do is, you go from the quantum to the molecular, you do a gigantic in lamps, a gigantic molecular dynamic simulation of what's called a domain wall. So you have a thermal bar and you flip the spin on one end and watch magnetic wave propagate through. And now we can use that as data to train our data-driven finite element model. And so in this way, we've built up this stack so that you can go from the quantum to the molecular to the continuum model, and you can bridge that linkage going from the material up until the device. So finally, we're gonna turn to this question about, now, if you have this digital twin, what exactly can you do with it? And so there's the obvious kind of thing that you can do where you have this digital twin, you can do forward simulation. So for a given design, you can simulate the behavior of that design. And you can also look at inverse problems, right? So you have all these parameters on that design. You can calibrate those in order to maximize or minimize some performance metrics, some quantity of interest. All right, so that's one thing that you can do with this. And this is why we were so careful to put all these knobs on these surrogates, right? Each one of these design parameters, now we can tune, but we can see how it affects the performance at a system level of everything all at once. And so we can optimize some sort of interaction with the environment. In this case, it would be some property of the beam, how diffuse it is, things like that. You can also use this to do feedback control, right? So you can put a thermocouple on your device. You could say this part of the device is running hot, dial down the voltage in this area, and look for strategies like that. But maybe more abstractly, to go beyond that sort of traditional modeling and simulation, forward and inverse modeling kind of paradigm, you can ask about how you could actually do artificial intelligence, right? So not just probe a specific design, but can we prompt new designs, or can we ask for information that can facilitate scientific discovery? So there's a lot of different tools within machine learning that could be brought to bear here. One in particular that we've been looking on, particularly for additive manufacturing and material systems, is this idea of multimodality. So in traditional computer science, you can imagine you have this picture, this abstraction of a bird here on the left. And that abstraction could be encoded in different modalities. So you could have a picture of that bird, you could have a sentence describing that bird. And what the human brain can do is it can integrate all of these disparate types of information, totally heterogeneous, and integrate them in a way so that they're greater than the sum of their parts. And so that's used to do things like fuse audio and text data to automatically build subtitles, right? And so for this talk, you could turn the subtitles on, and that's a machine learning algorithm that's blending those two modalities. So in science and engineering, we have different kinds of multimodal data that hasn't really been tapped into yet. You have high fidelity modalities that are difficult, slow to collect in large number, kind of low throughput, things like microscopy, X-ray things, probing microstructure, physical experiments, or costly synthetic experiments in terms of direct numerical simulation and so on. There's also low fidelity modalities that you can gather in large number in a high throughput way. And these are things like all the diagnostics, all of like the current coming off of your fabrication, things that are going on just during the typical manufacturing process. We'd like to integrate all of these to build a multimodal digital twin. And so just last December, there was an AI at DOE workshop that said this type of multimodal scientific machine learning is one of the most promising directions within DOE for the next decade. And so what we do here is we integrate all of these different modalities in this autoencoder kind of framework and encode them into a latent space so that they share a single common representation, which we model through a Gaussian mixture model, right? So this means that each one of these modalities is being encoded into a single cluster where the different modalities share some common information, right? And this is probabilistic, right? So we have a UQ framework where we can assign a probability to belong to each one of these clusters. And so now we decode that and we ask that it's able, we embed these physics-informed surrogates that we've been building that we introduced at the beginning of the talk. And so what you're asking for is a sieve, a way of digging through all of these different modalities such that you get a representation that encodes the underlying physics that are shared across these different modalities. And I'll refer to this paper in the bottom left for how we actually achieve that. So here's an experiment that we did. This is a metal additive lattice. We printed two different properties. You put it through a compression test. And so the two modalities that we have here are images of the microstructure along with this physical, the sort of scientific data response in terms of the stress strain curves. And so when you run this algorithm on the left, you can see each black dot corresponds to a pair of these two modalities. The red dots are clusters, and you can see it's swapping these black dots back and forth until it's figured out the two subpopulations in the data. And then what it's doing is all the way on the right, it's using this physics model to fit a linear strain hardening model to the data, right? So you're asking for these two subpopulations so that you get it in terms of the mechanics of the problem. But now you can go back and do generative sampling. So you can say, what exactly what microstructure corresponds to those two different physics at play? And it says, this is what the microstructure looks like. There are these two different things. So you can use that as a way to prompt hypothesis generation for scientists, right? There might be too many modalities for a human to kind of dig through. This will pop up like, here's a fingerprint. This says what's at play here. So we'll end on this note. I'd like to close with a couple topics for the breakout discussion. The first is, in your world, what kind of microelectronics co-design problems, or maybe not even microelectronics, right? What co-design systems are you familiar with that you think this sort of digital twins perspective is feasible, and where you can see how you could break it down into the scientific machine learning blocks? Second, where do you view the current capability gaps, right? There's a lot of hype here, a lot of machine learning tools, and not all of them are really ready for showtime. And what we're interested in doing is fleshing out the idea of trusted scientific machine learning, not just doing the latest and greatest kind of machine learning, but being principled and really bringing in the ingredients that we need so that we can, in a reliable way, perform high consequence engineering design. So I'll close there. Thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to joining you in the breakout discussions. Thanks.